Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. We just had another full day of 14 hours of NFL football. We are back to having another interesting day of recaps, a couple of players who returned and made their debut for the season, a couple of trades that happened this past week, and players making debuts with new teams. So it was definitely an interesting day of football. As always, I have my recap article up on the website right now where I go over all 12 games that happened today, the most interesting things that I found from each of those games, from each of those teams. But of course, I will go over my top couple recap biggest pieces of utilization that I found interesting over the course of the day. And we will go ahead and start with the Cleveland Browns backfield. We saw the return of Nick Chubb after missing over a year of football. First off, it was just great to see him back in uniform in general. I recall when he suffered the injury, thinking that we might have seen the last of his potential Hall of Fame career. So the fact that he was able to return in itself was great to see. But then it was also good to see just how much the Browns used him. He played a fairly significant role on early down, certainly not anywhere near what we typically saw Chubb at his peak, but still a very large role. And what was particularly noteworthy is that he was the running back that saw almost all of the touches, ran the ball 11 times for 22 yards, scored a touchdown. Also caught a pass for 10 yards where Pierre Strong, who was the other primary running back in this game, saw over half of the snaps, was the primary receiving down back as well as early down back. Only ran the ball 3 times and had one catch where Deontay Foreman was the third running back here and only carried the ball twice. It is worth noting that Jerome Ford, who had been the lead running back over the first part of the season, did miss this game due to a hamstring injury. So that certainly played somewhat of a role here. But I think once Ford is healthy again, that will primarily cut into Pierre Strong's playing time. So definitely great to see for Chubb. I do think there's a possibility that he will see more snaps going forward once he gets a little bit more comfortable in his playing time. Of course, he throughout his career has only pretty much played on early downs at the goal line and short yardage situations, not playing too much on third downs, not too much in 2-minute drills. So his playing time is only going to expand so much. My only real concern here is after we saw the Deshaun Watson injury, where at least right now we expect it to be season ending. That's what everyone expects. We'll get more official word tomorrow. But considering the Browns' record as well, there probably will be a point this season where the Browns are playing more so for next year than they are for this year, in which case they might play their young running backs a little bit more, or especially try to save Chubb if they still think he's going to be a great receiver, or not great receiver, great runner, that they might be saving him more so for 2025 when they think they can make a run again, because this season so far has not gone their way. But good to see here. I think with Jerome Ford, I would at least hold on to him for now, just because there is that possibility that he could split the early down snaps, still get the third down snaps. And like I said, if they are playing more for next year, then they might want to see a little bit more out of Ford this year and save Chubb a little bit more. But we'll see how these next couple weeks go. Definitely time to see how this backfield plays out after more games. It's just one game, but still good to see overall. Next backfield I want to cover is the New York Giants, where we saw Tyrone Tracy be the primary running back throughout this entire game, which was very good to see. We had seen him play well over the last 2 weeks in Devin Singletary's absence, and Singletary was able to return for this game. Saw a couple snaps basically throughout the game, but Tracy was the primary running back. It was a little hard to tell how much of this was Tracy playing well the last couple weeks, and if Singletary is just getting eased into action, and if he'll see more playing time next week. But it is worth noting that Coach Brian Daboll did say this past week that Tracy has earned more playing time, and we did see that in this game. So I think Tracy is someone that you definitely want on your fantasy roster. I know he is available still in roughly 50% of ESPN leagues, so a lot of leagues where he's still available. And anytime that a rookie is having a starting job this early in his career, definitely great to see out of him. In terms of production, he only ran the ball 6 times for 23 yards, so not the greatest day out of him. Had 3 receptions where Devin Singletary ran 5 times for 18 yards, had 1 reception. So in terms of fantasy production, not a good day out of any of the Giants running backs, but I think there are brighter days ahead. I think the blowout certainly played a role here, and ideally the Giants are at least a little bit closer in games going forward. With Singletary, I would at least hold on to him for one more week if you have him on your roster. I would like to see, once he is no longer on the injury report, if he ends up playing closer to half of the snaps compared to the role he saw in this game, or it's possible Singletary starts playing better than Tracy again. So we could see that happen as well. So I would at least like to see one more week, maybe more, if Singletary is still limited in practice, just to see what Singletary does once he's 100% again. But still definitely great to see out of Tracy. You don't see running backs become starters this early in the season very often, outside of players who are drafted very early. So definitely great news for Tracy and the Giants. Next situation I want to go over is the Bills and their running back situation. We saw last week Ray Davis have a great day out of the backfield, was the primary runner with James Cook missing a game due to injury. So that was great to see out of Davis play so well as a rookie. But we did see James Cook go back to having a significant role on early downs as well as at the goal line. But Cook still didn't play quite as much as we have seen in the past. We've seen Ty Johnson basically have the third down role all season, so that part hasn't changed. But we saw Cook run 12 times for 32 yards and a touchdown, and then we saw Davis only get to run the ball 5 times in his 12 or 13 snaps, but he ran for 41 yards and a touchdown and also had a catch in this game. So Davis looked pretty good as a runner. I think there's a chance that we see this get closer to 50-50. And I think this is one of the backfields where it's also possible we see 2 running backs have fantasy value going forward. Expect the Bills to be winning a lot of games in the future, in which case they should be running the ball a lot, when we could see both running backs see a lot of carries. They combined for 17 carries in this game, and it was a pretty comfortable lead, but I could see them running even more in future weeks, especially as we get later in the season. So definitely good to see out of this backfield. Do want to go over a couple of running back related things from the chat. First off, a question if we should drop Zach Moss. I think it's certainly worth considering. I think a lot of it depends on the size of your league at this point. We did see Chase Brown. He has slowly but surely seen more and more of those early down snaps, which led to a lot more touches in this game than Moss, and I wouldn't be surprised if those trends continue. Moss is still the receiving down back for Cincinnati and definitely the clear handcuff. It would be great to see if the Bengals started winning games like they used to in the past couple of years, in which case I could see both running backs having fantasy value. But for now, it seems like Chase Brown is the clear runner. So if you're in a league where a lot of backup running backs are on the waiver wire, would definitely be fine dropping Moss, but I also know there's a lot of leagues where most of the backup running backs are on rosters, and if Chase Brown does suffer an injury at some point this season, then I think we go back to seeing Moss as a clear every down back. So I think it just depends on the size of your league, how many teams there are, how many bench spots, and that'll determine if you would drop Moss, but I think he's definitely someone worth considering dropping. Next, I want to stick with the Bills, but go to the wide receivers. And we saw Amari Cooper get traded to the Bills this past week. He took the place of Marquez Valdes-Scantling on the roster. Valdes-Scantling was cut. And it was also interesting to see that Cooper basically took the playing time that we would expect out of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. We've seen the Bills basically use a rotation of Keon Coleman, Matt Collins, and before was Valdes-Scantling, and now is Cooper as the outside receiver. So typically on any given play, we would see 2 of those 3 receivers on the field, and then Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel would fight for snaps in the slot in 11 personnel. Samuel suffered an injury pretty early in this game, so Shakir saw a little bit more playing time than usual, and the other important thing to note is Amari Cooper did not impact Khalil's playing time. And even in this game, Cooper didn't really impact the playing time of Coleman or Hollins either. But given that Cooper has only been on the roster for a couple of days at this point, we fully expect Cooper to start seeing more playing time. I would expect it to be primarily at the expense of Matt Collins, but I could also see Keon Coleman potentially losing some snaps. Coleman did have a career game in this game, caught 4 passes, 125 yards, so that was great to see out of Coleman. Did include Coleman on my waiver wire players to target, even though Cooper's on the team now, just because anytime a rookie wide receiver plays that well in October, it's worth considering because he can always earn more playing time going forward. So that was definitely great to see out of Coleman, but I could see Coleman losing playing time. My big question is if Cooper is going to get to a point where he's on the field for almost every play, or if it's going to continue being a rotation at wide receiver. If we see Cooper and Coleman and Hollins all playing roughly 2/3 of the snaps, rather than Cooper going back to the role that we have seen him have basically at every other team he's played for throughout his career. But it'll be interesting to see. I thought the trade was interesting in that last year, once they made the change in offensive coordinator, we saw Stephon Diggs not have as big of a role. So when it came to my rest of season rankings, I wasn't really sure I would be changing Cooper too much, just because I thought there was a chance this could be another Diggs situation where defenses are focused on Cooper. So that means they can throw the ball to other receivers. So I think it'll be interesting to see. One game is too early to judge. Definitely great to see Cooper get a number of targets and a touchdown, though. So that was a promising start. So I think the Bills' offense will be interesting to see going forward. Before I get to my last wide receiver situation I want to cover, one question going back to the running backs, add Brooks or Pacheco. Right now, I would probably add Brooks. I don't know when Pacheco will or will not be back this season. I really haven't heard any updates on that recently, so I wouldn't be surprised if, because there's no updates, no one else in your league is probably thinking too much about picking him up if he's been available on the waiver wire in your league recently. So I'd pick up Brooks. I wouldn't be surprised if he is back this week. Did get activated to the at least to be able to practice, but I don't think he's on the 53-man roster quite yet. So a chance he's able to play. I don't know how much playing time he will see, but I think the second we hear any good news out of Pacheco and when he would return, I'd probably prefer Pacheco on my roster. But I think just depends on your league and how long you think you can get away with leaving Pacheco on the waiver wire before anyone else picks him up. Other wide receiver situation I want to cover today, and that is the San Francisco 49ers, where it was definitely an interesting day of what happened and what we could expect. First off, we knew Jawan Jennings would not be playing in this game, dealing with a hip injury, didn't practice the entire week. Hopefully he is back sooner rather than later. The fact that he was not placed on injured reserve is generally a good sign that he should at least be back in the next few weeks. But we did see Ricky Pearsall make his debut with the team. Had been on the non-football injury list after there was the incident where he was shot late in training camp. So we initially saw in this game Ricky take that slot role that we saw from Jennings typically. But then we had Deebo Samuel, who was on the injury report for a different injury. He ended up being sick and only played 4 snaps. Not the only incident today where a player was sick and it wasn't reported ahead of time. So a little bit frustrating. A number of other situations where players were on the injury report and we just never got the sense that they were going to be as limited as they were. So that was also a little concerning to see. So once Samuel went down, we saw Chris Conley basically become a starter for the team, taking more of an every down role. Even in 2 wide receiver sets, we were seeing a little bit more of Chris than Ricky, with Brandon Ayuk as the other wide receiver. But then we saw Ayuk suffer what we currently believe to be a season-ending injury, I believe ACL. But we'll find out tomorrow for sure after they run more tests and everything, but definitely did not look great out of Brandon Ayuk. After that point, Ricky ended up being an every down receiver, which was great to see that they trusted him in that kind of role in general, even though it took a couple of injuries to get there. But Ronnie Bell ended up being the other wide receiver in 11 personnel, and Jacob Cohen also ended up getting some playing time, rotating in and out. So this ended up being a situation where probably one of the more interesting wide receiver situations off the waiver wire. Had this question for a while if Jennings is the top wide receiver to target on the waiver wire this week. I do have him in my top 3 wide receivers to target. I have Romeo Doubs and Juju Smith-Schuster also up there. Probably the biggest tiebreaker for me among those receivers is the fact that the 49ers have a fairly difficult schedule for wide receivers going forward. And also, while I expect and we expect Jennings to take over as the every down receiver once he's healthy, we don't know that for sure. Because Brandon Ayuk was such of a distinct receiver in the 49ers offense, was the X receiver, taking most of his snaps on the line of scrimmage, on the outside, not playing in the slot all that much, and running more of those deeper routes. It's not obvious who's going to be taking those routes and that role in particular in the offense. We've seen basically all of the other wide receivers play some snaps in that role, but not a lot. There's a chance Chris Conley or Ronnie Bell sees more of those snaps. There's a chance Deebo Samuel does it. It's a chance that the 49ers just completely reinvent their offense without Brandon Ayuk in there. So because there's that uncertainty and the fact that they did spend a first-round pick on a wide receiver, that even though Jennings did play very well in his opportunities early in the season, there's also a chance that Ricky ends up becoming the number 2 wide receiver going forward. So that uncertainty makes Jennings a little bit lower on the list. I did have the comment in the chat that the Chiefs' playoff schedule is brutal, and the Chiefs also have a lot of rough games. It's really, for me, Romeo Doubs being number 1, him having these last 2 weeks where over the 2 weeks he's been a top 5 fantasy wide receiver, and the Packers have a much easier schedule, leads me to have Doubs at the top of my list. But I do think Jennings is definitely someone worth considering, since I think he does have a lot of upside if he does end up as the number 2 wide receiver for the 49ers. Last situation that I want, or I guess the 49ers were the last situation I wanted to cover. The only other thing I wanted to mention was the game tonight with the Jets and the wide receivers. Devontae Adams did become an every down starter for the Jets, which was slightly surprising that he played quite as much as he did. I think only missed 2 snaps over the entire game. Really meant Alan Lazard saw a much smaller role in this game. Lazard had consistently been playing in 12 personnel, didn't play in 12 personnel this week. And then even in 11 personnel, we thought Mike Williams was a clear third man out, but Lazard was only playing in roughly 2/3 of the snaps in 11 personnel, with Mike Williams taking the other 1/3. So Lazard, even though he had a decent game, made the most of his targets, he should have a much smaller role going forward. And Devontae Adams, clear starter. And the other big thing with the wide receivers is Lazard had been the clear slot receiver for the Jets. Now this meant Adams and Garrett Wilson started playing a little bit more in the slot than they had been. Adams was out of this world good in the slot in his last couple years with the Packers, and then the Raiders really didn't use him very much in the slot after adding Jacoby Myers, for example. So I wouldn't be surprised if this helps both Adams' fantasy value, and then Garrett Wilson, also the past 2 years, had been averaging more fantasy points per snap from the slot compared to out wide. So if Wilson also starts playing more snaps in the slot, that's generally a good sign. But this might only continue if they hold on to Mike Williams. If they do end up trading Williams, then Lazard will go back to seeing more time in 11 personnel, and then potentially back to seeing more time in the slot in 11 personnel. So that'll pretty much cover it for me for the top recaps for this game. Like I mentioned, I have a recap for all 12 games, at least one major note for every team that played today. And if you want to have more information, not just on the roles of the players, how they rotated in and out, but how well they played, information about defensive players, offensive line, with the PFF Plus subscription, we do have all of that. We have started having live data in premium stats over the past few weeks, which is something we never had before. So especially on these Sundays where I'm focused more on the recap article and not so much tweeting out snap counts and whatnot, you're able to find those snaps relatively live. There's a slight delay, but information that you won't be able to find anywhere else while games are going on. So you need a PFF Plus subscription for that, as well as most of my articles, my waiver article that'll be going out, 5 to add, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, my rankings as well. All of that you need a PFF Plus subscription for. So definitely check that out if you don't have that already. I will be back on the podcast on Tuesday morning, going over waivers with John like I do every Tuesday morning. Definitely interesting week off the waivers. A lot of tight ends who did well that are available on the waiver wire, and a little bit harder to find running backs this week now that a bunch of running backs are healthier now. So we'll go over some of the running backs that I'm most interested in then. On top of that, John will be on the IDP podcast. I'll have one for IDP usage out tomorrow morning. His usual one in the middle of the week, as well as Start Sit with Nick later in the week as well. So that'll cover it for week 7. And with that, peace out.